Vice Chancellor, Dr. Ramaran, Dr. Kapotkar, Chief Guest, other distinguished colleagues and students. Let me first of all thank Manipal University and Professor Arvind Kumar and the co-host, Dr. Sridhar Datta, for inviting me here to speak to you on this particular issue. I think it is a very timely conference that has been organized. But the timeliness, when Professor Arvind Kumar wrote to me about maybe a month or 2 months ago, he said, he asked me, he said, I would like you to speak about emerging dynamics of Indian foreign policy, continuity or change. So I said, fine, it's an interesting topic. But then I didn't know that it would be timed in a manner that the question would be being posed as it is in today's newspapers about the fact that there is a new foreign secretary who's taking over. So whether it is continuity or whether it is change. Now, I don't know how he figured all that when he designed the program for this conference. But just to indicate that that is how timely it is. Foreign policy was, people talked about the fact that whether we have a reactive policy or a proactive policy or, But the fact is that when we had the last election in 2014, foreign policy was not an issue in the election campaign. It was very little, depending if Prime Minister Modi was, he was in the northeast, he talked about refugees from Bangladesh. Or at one point, I think, he talked about following a very tough policy of Pakistan. But other than that, it was not really an election issue. And if you look at the BJP manifesto, it only talks about enlightened self-interest, which is self-evident, it's no big deal. So, in a sense, when it comes to national elections, we really don't find foreign policy playing that kind of a role. Yet, if you look at the new government's preoccupations in the last 6-7 months, you find that perhaps the area that has occupied the Prime Minister the most has been foreign policy related. Right from the time of his swearing in, when he invited leaders, SARC leaders, and also the Prime Minister of Mauritius for his swearing in, to the fact that his first foreign visits, Bhutan, and then Nepal, and then another visit later for the SARC summit in November to Nepal, his visits to Washington in September, and New York UN General Assembly, the G20 in Australia, the East Asia Summit in Myanmar, the BRICS Summit in Brazil, the incoming visits, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, the Russian President Putin, and now most recently Obama's sort of Republic Day visit, and so on. So if you look at all this, you probably see that there has been enormous amount of focus on foreign policy. So somehow, foreign policy has a habit of kind of imposing itself on national consciousness, irrespective of whether we think it is important or not important when it comes to elections or otherwise. But that's the reality, and that's what we've seen. Now, what are two aspects in Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy that we've seen so far? Two aspects come out very clearly. One is that we saw that he laid a lot of stress in terms of the region, the immediate neighborhood. And I think it was quite clear the fact that he invited these, the neighboring country leaders to India for his swearing in, the fact that he made his first visits two neighboring countries, the fact that he was there for the SAARC summit, and he has talked about regional connectivity. He has talked about reviving India's economic growth, and that in a manner helping the neighboring countries as well, and willingness to partner the smaller countries in our neighborhood in terms of helping them develop their resource base, their economies, their assets. He's held out the talk of an Indian satellite for SAARC. He's talked of more scholarships because of the fact that India's education institutions are much better than what exists in any of our neighboring countries. So he's talked about more people from the region coming and studying here and so on. Road connectivity, border-related infrastructure and so on. The second aspect of his foreign policy, which I think is in evidence, is a sense of pragmatism. And I think his relationship, or the manner in which he has gone about building up his relationship with the United States, is probably a clear indicator of that. I mean, if there was one Indian Prime Minister who should have held back from the US, it should have been Prime Minister Modi, because of the manner in which he had been treated. For 10 years or more, he had been on the visa ban list. But then when President Obama called him to congratulate him on his election victory and said, and invited him to visit Washington, Prime Minister Modi was pragmatic. He understood that, it was one thing when he was Chief Minister, but as Prime Minister of India, he looked at the larger picture. He was pragmatic enough to say, yes, thank you very much, and I will consider your invitation carefully. And the US also realized, in a sense, that look, we need to go out of our way to make sure that the gesture is taken seriously. And then they said, when you are there in New York for the UN General Assembly in September, why don't you come to Washington as well? Which is a departure from the norm, because normally, when the UN General Assembly summit takes place in September, you get a large number of prime ministers, presidents, and so on, who are in New York for that event. And if every one of them started going to Washington, it would be impossible. So by and large, the US government, does not entertain bilateral visits during that time. So the fact that they told the Indian government, they told Prime Minister Modi that, look, we understand you're going to be in New York for the UN General Assembly, and we will go out of our way in, so that you don't have to make two trips. We can accommodate you in Washington for a proper official bilateral visit at that time. And which was their way of signaling, as it were, that they also attributed importance to resuming or to reinvigorating India-US relations. Now, this is, then of course, I forgot to mention about his visit to Japan, which was another major thing because of the relationship that he has enjoyed with Prime Minister Abe and that part of it. Now, what had happened was, what all this has done, what all this diplomatic activity has done, is that it has given a new kind of a push, a new momentum to India's foreign policy interactions, foreign policy engagements, both within the neighborhood, as well as virtually with all the major powers. And we've sort of seen that he has engaged with various major powers in a very, very short while. Now, these relationships had kind of flagged, particularly in UPA-2, for a variety of reasons. The momentum with India-US relations had flagged after the liability bill was passed in 2010, and with all its ambiguities and so on. We had had some tax decisions which were retroactive or with retrospective effect, and we've just seen a decision yesterday where, on the Vodafone case, where now, after the High Court has decided against the Government of India, the Government of India has accepted it and will not go in appeal against the judgment, and so on. But what does all this renewed momentum imply? I mean, does it mean suddenly you start engaging in a big way with the major powers and in the neighborhood? Does it mean your foreign policy has suddenly become successful? What? Not necessarily, because you still need to have a lot of content. And I think that in terms of when this question is posed as to what are the emerging dynamics of our foreign policy, how much of it is continuity, how much of it is change? I mean, we can clearly see the change. First of all, we see the change in terms of, as I said, the imparting or reinvigorating or pushing, giving new momentum to our relationship, both in the region as well as with the major powers. But then part of it is also continuity, because after all, the whole nuclear issue, we are not starting today. It started in 2005, or actually, if you want to go back, it was even started in 1998. After the test was when the first sort of dialogue began between India and US. The first very successful Clinton visit which took place was in March of 2000, which started preparing the way for the change of dynamics between India-US relationship. Because before that, before Clinton visit of 2000, the previous US presidential visit was Carter's visit, which is more than 20 years earlier. And the Clinton visit was successful in cementing the change of perceptions. This was during Prime Minister Vajpayee's time. Was successful in changing perceptions between India and US. And this was followed up by the Bush administration. And that is how the next steps in strategic partnership were developed. This was followed up in 2005 with the Bush visit, or with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit and then the Bush visit, which led to the nuclear breakthrough. And eventually the signing of the India-US Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, which is generally known as the 123 Agreement. So you have, there is an element of continuity in all of this. Similarly, even in terms of the neighborhood, there's an element of continuity in terms of the relationship. And there are, of course, certain amount of changes also that the personal momentum, the personal chemistry, for example, Prime Minister Modi talked of his personal chemistry with President Obama. This is something which he has been able to, build in a very short while, and that also helps to change various things. But at the same time, there remain. I mean, that if we take the equation with Pakistan, we find that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was here for the swearing in. There were going to be talks. We had announced that there would be talks at the foreign secretary level. Then those talks were called off. We found that the Pakistani High Commissioner was meeting the Hurriyat leaders, and as a result, these talks were called off. Then there was a lot of speculation about whether the prime ministers would meet during the SAARC summit in Kathmandu, and we all saw the television images and all of that. We know that this neighborhood cannot be changed. So therefore, we will need to engage with Pakistan. How we define the terms on which we engage with Pakistan is something which we yet have to come up with. And it is not, it's not a very simple, it's one thing to say that we will give a very robust response to any violations on the line of control and things like that. But at the same time, it's a difficult policy to craft, because if you look back from 1998 till about say 2002, every year we would have about between 250 to 500 casualties of the Indian Army in Jammu and Kashmir, in terms of the interactions that would take place across the line of control. Now, 2002 end was when with a lot of help, international pressure, etc., etc. By the beginning of 2003, a ceasefire was imposed on the line of control, which continued during Musharraf's period and till about 2008, when Musharraf was ousted, and then Kiani became the army chief, and gradually Musharraf also was lost power, and which is when the ceasefire started breaking down. During that period, the number of army casualties in Jammu and Kashmir due to cross-border violations came down dramatically. And now they've started going up, as we just seen in the recent months. So all of this has a cost. You know, if you remember when the Indian Parliament was attacked in 2001, in January 2002, the Indian Army mobilized on the borders. You know what the rate of growth in 2002 was? It fell to 4%. It had a cost in terms of slowing down investment in India, in terms of reducing tourist inflow, and so on. And the next year, in 2003, when the ceasefire was announced, the rate of growth was back up over 7%. So if we are talking about economic growth and things like that, I mean, we have to take into account a whole host of factors when we define policy. So if it is, while we can say that we will retaliate vis-a-vis Pakistan in a robust manner, we also have to be conscious of the fact that if it gets linked up with escalation of tensions, then it may not be serving other interests. For example, sustained economic growth at 8%, 9%, etc., etc. So it becomes a far more complex exercise as to how do you engage. I'll give you another example of Afghanistan. We have a strategic partnership with Afghanistan, which was signed a few years ago during President Karzai's visit. Now we have seen a change of government in Afghanistan, and we have not yet had an occasion, while we are certainly concerned about the US withdrawal from the combat operations in Afghanistan, but the implications of that, or in terms of how are we going to deal with it, are still very unclear. And I know you have a separate session on your neighborhood. So what I'm trying to say is that while we have imparted a new momentum, there also has to be much more content, and that requires carrying with us for the new government, for Prime Minister Modi, all the stakeholders. If you look at the neighborhood, if you look at Pakistan, for example, you have the stakeholders, the services, the armed forces are very much stakeholders, because if there is tension, who deals with it? Their state of readiness, their kind of the equipment that they have, and so on and so on. So all of these become factors. So when I say of stakeholders, civil society is a stakeholder, the economy or the people who run the Indian economy are stakeholders, the services become stakeholders when it relates to border issues. States, certain states, bordering states like Jammu and Kashmir, or Punjab, or in the case of Bangladesh, you have West Bengal. I mean, we saw what happened when the land boundary agreement, which the previous government had negotiated, but they weren't able to push it through. And so, you know, the states which share boundaries, they become important stakeholders in foreign policy issues. And for the Prime Minister, it's very important to carry all these stakeholders with him if he has to push through his foreign policy initiatives. Nepal, this is one country which the Indian Prime Minister has visited twice in 6 months. First in August on a bilateral visit, and then second in November for the SAARC summit. Although even when he went there during the SAARC summit, the focus, a lot of focus was on the bilateral issues, and partly because Nepal has been undergoing a political transition, and those of you who have followed, you found that once again on 22nd of January, which was the deadline for completing the drafting of a new constitution, the deadline was passed and there is no new constitution. And And when the Prime Minister was there, he talked about the importance of implementation and delivery, which again is a hugely important thing, and this is one point that we need to focus on, because when we talk of, okay, we will do this, or we will build a dam, or we will build a hydro project, or we will build a oil gas pipeline between India and Nepal, or we will set up integrated checkposts on the border between India and Bangladesh, or between India and Pakistan, or India and Nepal. There are projects that have been held up for something like 10 years or more. When we built a trauma center in Nepal, which was held up for years and years because the government of Nepal remained unable to decide as to who should take it over, between the Ministry of Health or the local medical college, or etc., etc. Now, something like this, we can say that, okay, this is an internal issue for the government of Nepal, but the fact remains that this was a huge Indian investment out there, which just lay unutilized. And somewhere indirectly, there was also, it would reflect on the fact that the Indian government was not able to complete the project in time, because it would have been announced, as you can well imagine, it would have been announced with great fanfare when it was launched. But then by the time you end up actually implementing and delivering on it, it has lost, it doesn't give you the same impact, because its credibility has diminished. And I think this is a hugely, hugely important thing that we need to focus on in terms of our implementation capacity and our deliveries. The last aspect is, I guess, the instruments. We can have a change at the top. There's a new Prime Minister, and we know that he sleeps for only 3 hours a day, or 3 hours in the night, and he's up at whatever time and starts work at 6 and continues till whatever time. We've just seen there's a new Foreign Secretary, but ultimately the instrument of implementation still remains the Ministry of External Affairs. And if the Ministry of External Affairs has 800 diplomats, which is about the same number of diplomats as, let's say, Singapore or New Zealand, which are really tiny countries with just about 20-25 embassies. And if you compare that to something like 5,000 diplomats that China has, or 15,000 diplomats that the US has, then you realize the mismatch in terms of instruments. Unless all the diplomats start sleeping for only 3 hours a night. A bit difficult. But your instruments are your ministry. And it's not just the Ministry of External Affairs, because diplomacy is multidimensional today. It also means coordination, because sometimes you have Ministry of Commerce, Department of Industrial Promotion, you have Ministry of Finance, you've got Ministry of Defense, you've got the intelligence agencies, and etc., etc. So all of them need to be able to pull together to serve the same objective, which is larger than just one thing. If I told you that between India and the United States, in addition to the meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama, we had something like 30 dialogues at ministerial level, from culture to finance to commerce to climate change and so on, at ministerial levels every year. But compare that to between US and China, where they have about 100 ministerial dialogues every year. That shows the depth of the engagement that has now come to characterize foreign policy issues in a globalizing world. And I think Prime Minister Modi's his focus on foreign policy, notwithstanding the fact that it was not part of the original election plan on which he won this decisive election victory, notwithstanding that, the fact that he has given so much focus to foreign policy issues in his first 6-7 months, and received so many visitors, engaged in so many high-profile visits, has certainly given a new momentum, and he's trying to make his mark by bringing India back into the reckoning. But as Dr. Kapotkar reminded us, a lot of this also depends on getting the domestic house in order, on getting the economy moving again. Because how strong India is going to be outside, or how India's strength is going to be perceived outside will also depend greatly on how well India is doing in terms of its domestic economic performance. So this is where the two things are linked, and I think that this is where we will continue to see whether how much of change the foreign policy will be able to reflect will be particularly in this, because we also saw that the moment foreign policy interest started flagging in UPA2 also coincided with the time that our growth rate started dropping from 8% to 4%, 5%. So that's how we have to look at it. Thank you.